Welcome back, America. My next guest is Richard Goldberg, former senior official, National Security Council under President Trump. He's a senior advisor of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. But he's a highly regarded scholar and expert on issues related, especially to the Middle East, and even more directly, Iran. And this is what I want to discuss with you today, Richard, which is this. Why in the world would we have Vladimir Putin's government as the point of the spear negotiating with Iran on the behalf of the United States on another nuclear missile deal? Can you explain that to me, sir?
It is unbelievable and great to be with you, Mark. What basically happened was, as you recall, the Trump administration left that horrible nuclear deal with Iran back in 2018 and imposed the maximum pressure campaign. And it was working. Remember that old deal, they call it the JCPOA for short, the Iran nuclear deal. It was not working for the United States. Billions and billions of dollars to the Iranians to fund terrorism, to fund missiles, and to keep enriching uranium on their own soil. And we remember in 2018, the Israeli Mossad found the nuclear archive that they were hiding from the world throughout that nuclear deal, which has led the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, to find undeclared nuclear sites and still have questions about undeclared nuclear activities going on in the country today. And so President Trump left that deal and he decided to impose maximum pressure sanctions on the economy of Iran. And let's remember where that was when President Biden took office. The International Monetary Fund, Mark, said at the end of 2020, Iran was down to just $4 billion in accessible foreign exchange reserves. That's unbelievable, down from $122 billion in accessible foreign exchange reserves when President Trump started the maximum pressure campaign. What happened when President Biden took office? He had pledged to go back to that terrible nuclear deal. It was a campaign promise. It was ingrained in the Democratic Party's platform. And so he abandoned maximum pressure. And despite all these attacks by Iranian forces, militias, terrorist groups on U.S. troops in the Middle East, the fact that they were not accounting for this undeclared nuclear material and sites, he started relaxing sanctions. What did Iran do? They started advancing forward in their nuclear program more than ever. 20% enriched uranium, 60% enriched uranium, going closer and closer to that line of weapons-grade uranium, all while taking advantage of the sanctions relaxation that the Biden administration was providing. And so by the end of last year, Biden's negotiators, who had been engaged in this indirect negotiation with Iran for months in Vienna. Now think about this. We're not talking to the Iranians. They won't let us talk to them. We have to sit in a room at a hotel and pass messages down the hall to other countries to present to Iran, and then they do the same back to us. This has been going on for months. It's unbelievable. But what happened was the strategy wasn't working. Iran was becoming more threatening, getting closer to the nuclear threshold. And so rather than say, this isn't working, let's go back to maximum pressure, which was working, they decided to go to the Russians late last year and say, will you take over this negotiation? Will you take the ball? We'll go through your lead, handing Vladimir Putin the keys to this deal. And they didn't know that Russia was finally going to become the controversy that it is today, that we've all known for years that it was. They didn't expect Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine, as we know. But now here we see the deal that's on the table in Vienna has been brokered by the Russians. The Russian ambassador in Vienna is the lead negotiator now for the deal. And why that's important is not only is the deal itself on the table a disaster and a threat to national security, again, lifting $100 billion to give access to the Islamic Republic, the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, access to $100 billion to fund that terrorism, to fund missiles, to keep the advances in their nuclear program that they've gained over the last year under the Biden administration, more sanctions relief than the last deal, for fewer restrictions than the last deal. Totally crazy, a worse deal. If you thought the last deal was the worst deal in history, this is the new worst deal in history. But that's not the only disaster that's happening. If we lift those sanctions on Iran, and by the way, most of them terrorism sanctions today, not nuclear sanctions, terrorism sanctions. If we lift those sanctions on Iran, its central bank, all the other banks, its oil company, its tanker company, Russia is in a position to set up a sanctions evasion hub in Iran. The Central Bank of Russia, Sberbank, Gazprom Bank, other banks that are coming under sanctions in Russia, they will be able to do transactions in Iran with a sanctions-free central bank of Iran and sanctions-free Iranian banks and companies. This is a disaster because what will happen is the Iranians will say, don't you dare reissue sanctions on our banks just because we're letting Russia evade sanctions. If you do, we'll go back to nuclear extortion. And of course, as we've seen, the Biden administration doesn't just get tough, they don't try to deter, they run away from nuclear extortion. So we are setting up a deal that will not just give Iran the pathways to nuclear weapons, not just give Iran money to fund more terrorism against the West, but give Vladimir Putin the get-out-of-jail-free card from all of our sanctions.
It's unbelievable. Now, when we come back, Richard Goldberg, I want you to discuss with us, to the extent you know, what's in this deal. Apparently, there have been resignations with the negotiating team on the American side. There have been resignations elsewhere. There have been leaks by the bureaucracy, which is typically hostile to our own country. They're so concerned about what we're giving up to the Iranians. And apparently, all kinds of worldwide terrorists are going to get their freedom, and tens of billions of dollars more are going to flow into Iran. And it ensures that Iran does get nuclear weapons, but even on a faster track. I want you to elaborate on this for us when we return. We'll be right back.